Ancient Rome, an empire whose legions carved their name in the annals of history, from the shores of Britain to the sands of the Middle East. We admire their discipline, their architecture, their legal system. But what if we told you that behind every stone of the Colosseum and every page of the Gallic Wars lies a monstrous reality that few school textbooks mention? Are they ready to face this reality head-on? What if a person wakes up tomorrow not in their cozy bed, but on the cold stone of a Roman barracks, and their life turns into a hell full of pain, humiliation, and the constant threat of death? Today we will travel to the heart of the Roman legion and try to understand what it was like to be a Roman soldier. Forget the heroic myths and valiant warriors marching to glory. This will be a day full of blood, sweat, fear, and inhuman trials. We will reveal 10 facts that Hollywood movies will never show you, and after which your perception of the greatness of Rome will be forever changed. If you are ready for this merciless journey through time and want to know the true price of Roman power, watch this video to the end. Roman legions marched across the known world, but their every step was followed not only by conquest, but also by an invisible threat. Imagine a Roman soldier, after an exhausting march under the scorching sun or pouring rain, is dying of thirst. Before him is a muddy stream through which thousands of soldiers and their horses have just passed, followed by carts and livestock. This is his only source of drinking water. No purification, no boiling. He drinks this water full of dirt, excrement, and microbes that ancient medicine could neither recognize nor neutralize. Did he ever think that his heroic campaign might end not by the sword of the enemy, but by bloody dysentery, which would slowly and painfully kill him in his own tent? If you want to know how the Romans fought an enemy they couldn't even see, watch this video to the end. This is no exaggeration. The lack of sanitary conditions was one of the main causes of catastrophic mortality in the Roman army. Imagine a soldier, exhausted and dehydrated, leaning over a stream filled with waste and even animal carcasses. He drinks this murky liquid, tasting its disgusting flavor, but he has no choice. With every sip, he brings legions of invisible enemies into his body. Bacteria, viruses, parasites, they attack his digestive system, causing uncontrollable vomiting and diarrhea. His body quickly loses its last reserves of strength, dehydration sets in, and he finds himself in excruciating agony. In the conditions of a field camp or barracks, where hundreds of people lived in cramped quarters, the disease spread like wildfire. One sick soldier could infect an entire centuria in a matter of hours. Ancient doctors did not understand the nature of such epidemics and were powerless against them. They could only watch as one soldier after another grew weak, writhed in pain, and died in their own excrement. This death was not heroic, but humiliating and lonely. His life, sacrificed to Rome, could end not in glorious battle, but in the agony of an invisible infection that he himself had drunk. Even if a legionnaire survived the first attack of the disease, his body was exhausted, weakened, and he became an easy target for other ailments. Constant malnutrition, fatigue, and lack of adequate medical care created ideal conditions for the development of chronic diseases. Soldiers often suffered from parasitic infections that caused constant stomach pain, anemia, and general weakness. Internal organs gradually deteriorated, and the immune system was so weakened that the body could not resist even common colds. Every campaign became a test of survival, where disease was no less dangerous an enemy than enemy troops. The life of a Roman soldier was far from the romanticized notions of glorious victories and valiant battles. Behind every triumph were thousands who died from diseases that modern medicine can easily treat. The very organization of the Roman army, its logistics and tactics, contributed to the spread of infections. Marches along dusty roads raised billions of germs into the air. Camps, quickly erected and often left without proper cleaning, became hotbeds of infection. The lack of separate places for drinking, cooking, and relieving oneself was the norm, which inevitably led to the contamination of water and food. The Romans, of course, tried to improve sanitary conditions in their permanent settlements by building aqueducts and sewers, but in the field, these benefits of civilization were unavailable. Water for thousands of people was collected from nearby rivers or wells, which quickly became contaminated. Food was prepared in primitive conditions, without observing basic hygiene rules. Meat, which was a rarity, was often not cooked thoroughly, and vegetables and fruits, if they were available at all, were not washed. All these factors multiplied the risk of infection, turning every meal into a potential game of Russian roulette. The mortality rate from dysentery and other intestinal infections was so high that it sometimes exceeded the losses from combat. Some historians claim that up to 90% of deaths in the Roman army were due to disease rather than combat injuries. Thus, every sip of water, every bite of food, every night in an overcrowded tent carried a threat. Roman soldiers lived in a constant struggle not only with external enemies, but also with invisible killers that undermined their health and strength. It was a curse from which neither armor, nor sword, nor even valor could save them. It was an enemy that slowly and painfully devoured the legionary from within, leaving behind only a shadow of his former strength and glory. In conditions of constant overcrowding, lack of basic hygiene, and no way to wash their clothes, Roman legionaries were literally living incubators for lice and fleas. This was not just unpleasant, it was deadly. These tiny parasites were carriers of diseases such as typhus, which could wipe out an entire legion faster than the bloodiest battle. Imagine yourself in a stuffy, overcrowded barracks where every body is swarming with parasites. The itching is unbearable, and the soldier could find solace only in the strong embrace of a comrade, if not for this endless nightmare. He constantly feels invisible killers crawling on his skin, and every bite could be the beginning of his agony. This was not a battle against barbarians, but against an enemy that penetrated his skin and devoured him from within. Let's delve deeper into this nightmare. The soldier constantly feels tiny creatures crawling over his body. His skin itches, and he scratches it until it bleeds, creating open wounds that quickly become infected in unsanitary conditions. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. These parasites aren't just irritants, they're deadly couriers. With every bite, lice or fleas inject rickettsia bacteria into his body, causing typhus. After a few days, fever, headache, and chills set in. His body aches and he is covered in a rash. Delirium and hallucinations become his constant companions. In a crowded barracks with no ventilation and the smell of disease hanging in the air, he becomes a source of infection for his comrades. The medicine of the time had no concept of viruses or bacteria, so treatment was useless. He may die of exhaustion, organ failure, or complications such as gangrene. Thousands of soldiers died of typhus in every major campaign, and their deaths were no less brutal than those on the battlefield. This is not just a disease, it is a slow, agonizing decline, where his body becomes food for parasites while he is still alive. Imagine not only the physical, but also the psychological torment. Constant itching deprives them of sleep and exhausts the nervous system. Soldiers cannot concentrate on their duties, and their combat effectiveness declines. The revulsion toward their own bodies, which are infested with parasites, becomes unbearable. Soldiers suffering from typhus often experience severe depression and despair. They saw their comrades dying around them and knew that the same fate awaited them. In conditions where hygiene was virtually impossible and clothes were rarely washed, if at all, lice and fleas multiplied at an alarming rate. Legionnaires wore the same woolen clothes for months, sometimes even years, creating an ideal environment for parasites to thrive. Typhus epidemics caused by lice were a scourge of the Roman armies throughout their history. During long sieges or campaigns in cold regions, where soldiers were forced to wear warm but unhygienic clothing, typhus outbreaks were particularly devastating. For example, during the wars in Dacia or on the Germanic frontiers, where the climate was harsh and sanitary conditions were primitive, the legions suffered enormous losses from diseases carried by parasites. Roman doctors, despite their knowledge in other areas of medicine, were completely powerless in the face of typhus epidemics. They did not understand that the disease was transmitted through insect bites and tried to treat the symptoms rather than the cause. This led to infected soldiers remaining in the general population, continuing to spread the disease. Death from typhus was painful. High fever, constant body aches, hallucinations, and delirium were followed by a slow decline. The skin was covered with a characteristic rash, sometimes accompanied by necrosis. Ultimately, organ failure and exhaustion led to death. The bodies of dead soldiers were burned or buried in mass graves to prevent further spread of the infection, but often it was too late. The entire camp was infected, and new victims appeared every day. The disease spared neither ordinary soldiers, centurions, nor even senior commanders. Thus, tiny, seemingly harmless creatures became a powerful weapon capable of destroying an entire army without firing a single shot. Lice and fleas were not just unpleasant companions of the Roman soldier, but deadly enemies that penetrated the most protected places, his skin, his flesh, and slowly but surely took his life. This invisible war was waged constantly, and its losses were enormous, leaving behind not battlefields but fields of death from disease. A Roman soldier, part of the greatest military machine, but his diet consists of hard biscuits, grains, and rare pieces of salted fat. Fresh vegetables and fruits are an unattainable luxury. Long marches, sieges of cities, and interrupted supply lines meant that legionaries were constantly undernourished and suffered from vitamin deficiencies and scurvy. Imagine, his gums bleed, his teeth are loose and falling out, his body is covered with sores, and his muscles are so weak that he cannot lift a weapon. He dies of hunger and exhaustion, surrounded by seemingly fertile land, but deprived of the opportunity to obtain the food he needs. His death is slow and humiliating, and it brings no glory. Starvation in the Roman army was not a rare exception, but a constant threat. Prolonged sieges could turn soldiers into living skeletons. Imagine, his stomach is cramping with pain. He feels constantly nauseous, but there is nothing to eat. He sees his comrades exhausted, falling and not getting up. At such moments, even the gaze of a comrade equally emaciated and hungry could offer only bitter consolation, but not food. The diet, consisting mainly of grain, did not provide the body with all the necessary nutrients. The vitamin C deficiency was particularly acute, leading to scurvy. This terrible disease caused bleeding gums, tooth loss, hemorrhages under the skin, and then tissue decay. His wounds would not heal. The slightest bruise turned into a huge bruise, and his bones became brittle. A soldier suffering from scurvy could not fight. He became a burden to the legion. His body gradually decayed from within until he died of complete exhaustion or related infections. It was a death that robbed him not only of his life, but also of his human form, turning him into a walking corpse. And all this happened in lands that could have fed him, but which had been ravaged by war or were inaccessible due to enemy action. The supply problem was one of the biggest headaches for Roman commanders. The further the army advanced from Rome, the more difficult it was to deliver food. Long supply lines were vulnerable to enemy attacks and also depended on weather conditions and the state of the roads. During the winter months or periods of prolonged rain, when roads became impassable, legions could be cut off from supplies for weeks or even months. Under such conditions, a soldier's rations were reduced to a minimum and then disappeared altogether. Soldiers were forced to find food on their own, foraging, which often led to clashes with the local population and even greater exhaustion. The consequences of malnutrition manifested themselves not only in scurvy, but also in other vitamin deficiencies. A lack of B vitamins led to nervous disorders, weakness, and paralysis. The lack of vitamin D caused bone problems, making them brittle and prone to fractures. Under conditions of constant physical exertion and poor nutrition, the soldier's body quickly wore out. Muscles atrophied, endurance declined, and even the strongest warriors turned into weak, emaciated people. Hunger also undermined the morale of the army. Despair caused by constant hunger led to riots, desertion, and a general loss of discipline. Legionnaires who had not seen normal food for months were ready to do anything to satisfy their hunger, even if it meant disobeying orders or attacking civilians. Some historians describe cases of cannibalism during particularly severe periods of famine. Although the Romans tried to organize supplies by creating warehouses and building roads, the scale of their campaigns often exceeded their logistical capabilities. An army of tens of thousands of men consumed enormous amounts of food every day. Maintaining such a flow of food during long campaigns was a daunting task that was not always feasible. As a result, hunger and disease caused by malnutrition became one of Rome's most effective allies. Ultimately, death by starvation was one of the most common and painful deaths for Roman soldiers. It was not a heroic death on the battlefield, but a slow, humiliating decline that robbed a person of their strength, dignity, and ultimately their life. Surrounded by seemingly fertile lands, Roman soldiers died of exhaustion, turning into living corpses before their bodies finally succumbed to the onslaught of an invisible but deadly enemy, starvation. Imagine a Roman soldier marching under the scorching sun of Africa or the Middle East. He is wearing heavy metal armor, an airtight helmet, and a thick woolen tunic. He is carrying dozens of kilograms of equipment. His body temperature is rising rapidly. Sweat is pouring into his eyes, and every drop of liquid evaporates before it has time to cool his skin. He feels dizzy and nauseous. His muscles are cramping. Hyperthermia, or heat stroke, was a common cause of death for legionnaires in hot regions. He simply collapses from exhaustion, his body overheats, his organs fail, and he dies in complete exhaustion, suffocating in his own sweat without a single wound. It was a silent death that no one paid attention to in the heat of battle. It was not just unpleasant, it was deadly. In the hot climate, under heavy armor and fully equipped, a soldier's body turned into a steam oven. The helmet, which protected against blows, also prevented heat from escaping, creating unbearable stuffiness inside. The woolen tunic, although it protected from the sun, did not allow the skin to breathe. He felt the blood pounding in his temples and his consciousness slowly slipping away. Heat stroke began with a headache and dizziness, followed by nausea and vomiting. His muscles cramped, and then his whole body began to convulse. His skin became hot and dry because his body could no longer sweat. Internal organs began to fail, and the brain suffered from edema. He lost consciousness and then died, literally burning from the inside. This death was quick and invisible to the others, who continued their march, paying no attention to their fallen comrade. His body was simply left on the side of the road like useless cargo and quickly forgotten. Only a few could afford to linger to silently say goodbye to someone who, just yesterday, they had called a friend, and perhaps even something more. How did the Romans deal with enemies who hid behind strong walls, avoiding direct confrontation? They didn't just storm the city, they methodically destroyed it. Imagine yourself as a defender of a besieged city. The Romans didn't just throw stones. They used sapper work, digging under the walls to cause them to collapse, or breaking through tunnels directly under enemy positions. But that's not all. They could also poison wells and water sources, leaving the besieged without drinking water. Even worse, they could block drains and sewage systems, turning the city into a plague center where the besieged would suffocate in their own stench and die from diseases spreading at the speed of wildfire. They would be unable to flee or fight. They would be walled up alive in their own city, watching it turn into a mass grave. Imagine that you are inside the besieged city. The walls that were supposed to protect him become his prison. The Romans, masters of siege warfare, do not simply storm the city, they methodically destroy it from within. They begin by poisoning the water sources. The besieged see the inhabitants who have drunk from the wells begin to writhe in pain and die. Thirst becomes unbearable, but every drop of water is now deadly. Then they begin to block drains and sewers. Soon the city turns into a foul-smelling swamp. Sewage accumulates in the streets, becoming a breeding ground for disease. Dysentery, typhus, and plague spread with terrifying speed, killing civilians and soldiers alike. The besieged are suffocating from the stench, their bodies weakened by hunger and thirst, and now they are being attacked by deadly epidemics. They watch their loved ones and comrades die around them, powerless to do anything. And finally, the sapper work. They hear muffled blows underground. The Romans are digging tunnels, undermining the walls. At any moment, the wall could collapse, burying hundreds of people beneath it. Or they could dig a tunnel right under the barracks, and in an instant, the legionaries would appear in the middle of the city, delivering a deadly blow from within. The besieged are walled up alive without food or water, surrounded by disease and death. Their agony is long and painful, and they have no chance of survival. If a soldier survived the battle and did not die from wounds, disease, or exhaustion, the worst fate could befall him: captivity. The Romans did not take prisoners for exchange or ransom, unless they were noble persons. For an ordinary soldier or civilian, captivity meant slavery. He could be sold at a slave market, separated from his family forever, and end up doing hard labor in mines or on galleys, where his life would be short and full of suffering. Or he could be forced to fight in the arena as a gladiator, where his death would be entertainment for the crowd. He would be deprived of his name, dignity, and freedom, and his only purpose in life would be to obey his master's orders or participate in a bloody spectacle where every fight was his last. Imagine that a soldier, wounded and exhausted, is taken prisoner. His eyes meet the cold, indifferent gaze of a Roman centurion. There is no mercy for him. He is not a noble prisoner for whom a ransom can be paid. He is simply a commodity. His chains rattle as he is driven along dusty roads to the nearest slave market. There he will be sold like cattle, with no right to a voice, no right to choose. His family, if he had one, is lost forever. Hellish labor awaits him. He will work in the mines, underground, in the heat and dust, until his lungs give out. He will row on galleys chained to a bench, under the scorching sun and the blows of the overseers, until his body is exhausted. His life will consist of pain, humiliation, and endless labor. And if he is young and strong, he may be sent to a gladiator school. There he will be trained in the art of killing, only to fight in the arena for the entertainment of the crowd. Each of his fights will be his last. He will kill or be killed until his body falls and his death becomes part of a bloody spectacle. This is not death, it is non-existence, where his personality is erased and his existence is reduced to an instrumental function. Sometimes, among other slaves like himself, he finds brief but intense comfort in the closeness of another doomed soul, realizing that he is not alone in this hell. Over time, constant exposure to an atmosphere of violence and death, participation in looting and massacres of the civilian population, dulls human feelings. The Roman soldier begins to see the enemy not as a human being, but only as a target, an object to be destroyed. Compassion atrophies and cruelty becomes the norm. He can watch his comrades being beaten half to death, women and children being enslaved, and feel nothing. He participates in these acts himself, and his mind justifies them as necessary. He becomes a killing machine, devoid of moral principles, for whom another person's life has no value. This transformation of the soul is the most terrible price a Roman soldier pays for the greatness of the empire. His soul slowly dies. He joins the Roman army, perhaps as an ordinary farmer or craftsman with normal human feelings. But the daily reality of war, the necessity of killing, looting, and participating in mass killings, gradually erodes these feelings. He sees his comrades beaten unconscious with vites, prisoners crucified, women raped, and children enslaved. At first, this causes disgust and horror, but over time, these emotions become dulled. He begins to justify these actions, convincing himself that they are necessary for Rome's victory. He begins to see his enemies not as people, but as objects to be destroyed. Empathy disappears, replaced by indifference and cynicism. He becomes part of a ruthless machine that knows no mercy. He himself participates in these atrocities, and his hands are covered with the blood of innocents. When he looks in the mirror, he sees a stranger, heartless, cruel, capable of any violence. This moral degradation is no less tragic than physical injury. He loses himself, his humanity, becoming nothing more than a shell that carries out orders. A Roman soldier's victory is measured not only by the number of enemies he has defeated, but also by the number of trophies he has collected. The most coveted of these is the severed head of an enemy. The Romans, like many ancient peoples, practiced beheading their fallen enemies and displaying their heads as symbols of victory and intimidation. Imagine, he sees rows of heads impaled on stakes, their eyes staring into nothingness, their faces contorted in agony. This terrifying sight was intended to strike panic into the hearts of their remaining enemies, making them realize the futility of resistance. But what is it like to see those dead eyes every day? To smell the stench of decaying flesh? It turns him into a participant in this barbaric ritual, destroying what remains of his humanity. He doesn't just cut off his enemy's head, he displays it. It is an act of psychological terror, designed to break the enemy's will before the battle even begins. Imagine the scene. He approaches the battlefield, and before him tower stakes with the severed heads of his comrades. Their eyes are glassy, their faces contorted in the agony of death. The smell of decaying flesh mixes with the smell of fear. He sees other warriors trembling, losing their composure, their fighting spirit evaporating. But he is not just a witness. He is also the executioner. After victory on orders, he cuts off the head of the defeated enemy. His hands are stained with blood, and his dead gaze haunts him. It becomes part of his routine, part of the ritual. He grows accustomed to the horror, to the smell of death, to the sight of mutilated bodies. This practice turns him into an accomplice to barbarism, making him increasingly insensitive and cruel. He loses his humanity with every trophy he cuts off, and this loss of soul is the most terrible of all wounds that can be inflicted in war. Imagine that a Roman soldier is participating in a long siege of an enemy city that drags on for months or even years. Food supplies are running out, and hunger is becoming unbearable. Despair reaches such proportions that soldiers begin to eat everything they can find. Plant roots, skin, insects, rodents. In some particularly severe cases, historical sources describe how the besieged, and sometimes even the besiegers, resorted to cannibalism, eating the bodies of fallen comrades or enemies. Soldiers are faced with a choice: die of starvation or commit the unthinkable to survive. This horrific act, driven by extreme necessity, leaves permanent scars on the soul and is one of the darkest aspects of Roman military history. Hunger is not just an unpleasant feeling, it is a torture that slowly drives one mad. Under the conditions of a prolonged siege, when food is running out, he begins to experience unbearable torment. His stomach cramps, his head spins from weakness, and every movement is difficult. He sees his comrades, exhausted, falling and unable to get up. He searches for anything edible: rodents, insects, tree bark, but even that becomes scarce. He may even share his last meager ration with someone he has grown attached to during his service, as a sign of silent support. In the most terrible cases, when despair reaches its limit, human nature breaks down. Historical chronicles do not shy away from describing cases of cannibalism during sieges. A warrior driven to complete exhaustion faces a horrific choice: die of hunger or eat the flesh of a fallen comrade or enemy. It is not simply a matter of survival, it is a matter of preserving the last shred of humanity. He does it, and every sip poisons not only his body, but also his soul. This act will leave an indelible mark on him, haunting him in his nightmares if he survives at all. He will live with the shame, knowing that he did the unthinkable to survive. A Roman soldier who followed all orders and fought to the last could face the worst fate if his cohort or legion was defeated. He wasn't killed by the enemy, but he had to face trial by his own commanders. For failure, for retreat, even if it was the only way out, he would face a humiliating and painful execution at the hands of his own comrades. This could be stoning, flogging to death, or in the worst case, decimation, when every 10th soldier, regardless of his personal merits, was chosen by lot and executed by his own comrades. He died not as a hero, but as a coward or a failure, and his death became a lesson for others. This was the last, most cynical form of control, showing that Rome was willing to sacrifice anyone to maintain its myth of invincibility. A soldier might think he had survived the battle, but the real threat came from his own side. If his legion was defeated, the commanders would start looking for someone to blame. Roman discipline did not forgive weakness. The soldier was accused of cowardice, of being unable to keep formation, of not dying for Rome. He was sentenced to death at the hands of his own comrades. This was not a blow with a sword in battle. It was a slow, painful death at the hands of those with whom he had shared bread and blood. He could have been tied to a stake and stoned to death. Or he could have been flogged with whips that tore the flesh from his body until he died of pain and blood loss. But the most terrible fate was decimation. Imagine, he was standing in line, and by lot, every 10th soldier in his unit was to be executed. He looked at his friend, who had just drawn the short straw. Perhaps this friend was more than just a comrade in arms to him. He would be killed by him and his comrades so that the rest would understand what discipline meant. His death was not heroic. It was humiliating and shameful, serving as a lesson to others. He did not die at the hands of the enemy, but at the hands of those who were supposed to be his family. This is the ultimate and most cynical form of control, showing that Rome valued not the life of a soldier, but only its own invincibility, which it maintained even at the cost of killing its own people. We have just spent a day in the shoes of a Roman soldier. It was a day filled not with heroic glory, but with exhausting labor, fear, filth, and pain. From the cold of the morning barracks to the bloody madness of battle, from humiliating punishments to the loss of one's own identity, every moment of a legionnaire's life was steeped in suffering. The Roman greatness we admire so much was forged on the bones, sweat, and blood of millions of such soldiers, whose lives were sacrificed to the ruthless machine of the empire. It was not an adventure, but a daily struggle for survival, where death could come from an enemy's sword, from disease from the hand of a centurion, or simply from exhaustion. Think about that the next time you see the majestic ruins of Rome. Behind every arch, behind every temple, there is a story of monstrous suffering and endless sacrifice of those who fell under the onslaught of the Roman military machine. If this dive into the dark side of Roman military history has made you think about the nature of power and cruelty, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new videos about the most mysterious, shocking, and sometimes frightening pages of history. Click the bell to be the first to know about our new releases and continue exploring the past with us.